Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start with ancient Rome, and before your brain goes straight to gladiators and togas and Julius Caesar dramatically collapsing on marble steps, I need you to know something. The Romans had rules, extraordinary rules. Rules that at first glance seem completely insane, and at second glance reveal a civilization that was solving very real problems in very creative ways. Rules about who could wear what color, rules about where you could die, rules about how many people could attend your funeral, rules about what you were allowed to eat at a dinner party. All of them weird, all of them with a reason behind them that makes complete sense once you understand the context. So if you're ready, let's step back into the most sophisticated and most bizarre civilization the ancient world produced. If you wake up as a Roman senator in the year 50 before our era, the first thing you notice when you put on your clothes is the stripe. A broad purple stripe running down the front of your toga. Not because you chose it, not because you like purple particularly, but because Roman law specifies exactly who is allowed to wear exactly what color and width of stripe on their clothing. And violating that specification has consequences that go well beyond a fashion faux pas. Purple in the ancient world was not simply a color, it was an economic statement. Tyrian purple, the most prestigious variety, was extracted from sea snails of the genus Murex. Producing 1 gram of the dye required approximately 9,000 snails. 1 gram. The labor involved in collecting, processing, and extracting the dye made purple fabric worth more than its weight in gold in some periods of Roman history. A pound of purple dyed wool could cost the equivalent of 3 years of an average worker's wages. So when Roman sumptuary laws specified who could wear purple and how much of it, they were not being arbitrary about fashion. They were managing a visible social hierarchy in a world without photographs, without identification documents, without any of the systems we use to instantly communicate social status. Your clothing was your resume, your business card, and your government ID simultaneously. When a senator walked into a room, everyone in that room needed to know immediately who he was and what authority he carried. The stripe communicated that instantly and unambiguously across a crowded forum, across a public bath, across any social space where rank determined how you were treated and what you were owed. The emperor wore full purple. The senators had their broad stripes. The equestrian class had narrow stripes. Everyone else wore white or undyed wool. The system was rigid, visible, and enforced. People were prosecuted for wearing purple above their station. Not because the Romans were particularly concerned about fashion, but because impersonating a higher social rank was a form of fraud that undermined the entire information system the society depended on to function. Now here is where it gets interesting. The Roman rule about purple extended to something that sounds even stranger. You were not allowed to dye in certain places. Specifically, you were not allowed to dye inside the sacred boundary of Rome, the pomerium. This was not a practical suggestion. It was a law with religious and legal consequences. The Roman concept of religious pollution, nefas, held that death contaminated sacred spaces and required elaborate purification rituals to restore their ritual purity. The pomerium was the sacred boundary that defined Rome as a religiously consecrated space, distinct from the ordinary world outside it. This meant that if you were terminally ill inside Rome, you were supposed to be moved outside the city boundary before you died. If you died inside unexpectedly, your body had to be removed through specific gates, not the main public gates, but designated gates associated with funerary processions, and the area where the death occurred required ritual purification before normal activity could resume. This sounds absurd until you realize that Rome had no germ theory of disease, no understanding of infection in the modern sense, but had observed very clearly over centuries that places where bodies were kept or decomposed were associated with illness among the living. The religious concept of death pollution was doing the work that microbiology would not explain for another 19 centuries. Keep the dead away from the living spaces. Keep the burial grounds outside the city. Maintain the separation. The rule was religiously framed but functionally sound. The same logic applied to burials. Roman law, specifically the 12 Tables, which were the earliest codified Roman laws from the 5th century before our era, explicitly prohibited burial within the city limits. The great roads leading out of Rome, the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, were lined with tombs for exactly this reason. The dead lived outside the city, the living lived inside, and the boundary between those two worlds was maintained with considerable care and considerable ceremony. Funerals themselves were regulated in ways that seem excessive until you understand what they were preventing. The 12 Tables limited the number of mourners, the number of musicians, the number of expensive garments that could be burned with the body, and the elaborateness of the tomb that could be constructed. These regulations were not about frugality as a virtue in the abstract. They were about preventing the competitive escalation of funeral display that had become ruinously expensive for aristocratic families competing to demonstrate their status through increasingly elaborate ceremonies for their dead. Wealthy Roman families had been bankrupting themselves trying to outdo each other's funerals. The regulations capped that competition. You could mourn your dead with appropriate ceremony. You could not use your dead as an opportunity to financially destroy yourself in a display competition with your social rivals, which, when you frame it that way, sounds less like an intrusion on personal freedom and more like a reasonable intervention in a collective action problem. Roman dining rules are another category where the initial strangeness gives way to something more comprehensible. The sumptuary laws that governed clothing also governed food. At various periods of Roman history, there were laws limiting how much could be spent on a dinner party, what foods could be served, and how many guests could attend. Specific luxury foods were periodically banned. Dormice, a particular delicacy that wealthy Romans kept in special clay pots called glirieria and fattened on nuts before eating, were restricted. Certain imported wines were restricted. The practice of serving multiple courses of imported luxury foods was restricted. Again, this sounds like the government being bizarrely involved in people's dinner parties. And in one sense it was. But the underlying problem being addressed was real. The Roman elite was importing luxury food items in quantities that were creating significant trade imbalances and draining silver out of the Roman economy into the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The elder Pliny complained in the 1st century that Rome was losing 100 million sesterces per year to India alone through the luxury trade. The sumptuary laws were an attempt to reduce that drain by limiting consumption of imported luxuries. They largely failed, as sumptuary laws almost always do, because they created a black market for precisely the items they restricted and gave those items additional cachet through their forbidden status. But the underlying economic logic was not stupid. The Romans had identified a real problem. Their solution was clumsy and unenforceable, but they were trying to solve something that genuinely needed solving. The Roman rules around the gladiatorial games reveal another layer of this pattern. From the outside, the games look purely like entertainment, spectacle, organized violence for the amusement of the crowd. And they were all of those things. But they were also heavily regulated in ways that reveal sophisticated thinking about crowd control, social pressure release, and the management of a population that had real grievances. The editor, the person who funded and organized the games, operated under strict rules about what the games had to provide. A minimum number of combats, a minimum level of spectacle, specific categories of gladiator that had to be represented. Failure to deliver what had been promised resulted in consequences that went beyond audience disappointment into the territory of legal liability and social disgrace. The editor was making a public commitment that had to be honoured. From the other direction, the crowd had specific recognised rights in the games. The gesture of the turned thumb, or more precisely a raised fist with thumb extended, was a formalised communication from the crowd to the editor about whether a defeated gladiator should be spared. The editor was not obligated to follow the crowd's preference, but ignoring it entirely, especially if the crowd was strongly unified in one direction, was politically dangerous in ways that the editor had to calculate carefully. The games were a space where the ordinary Roman population had a recognized, formalized voice in a public decision, which was unusual in a society that gave the common people limited political power. This is not an accident. The games were designed, consciously or not, to provide the Roman urban population with a regular experience of collective power, of having their preferences matter, of having their voice heard in a dramatic public setting. An urban population that regularly experienced that feeling was somewhat less likely to direct its frustration toward the political system. Bread and circuses was not simply contemptuous dismissal of the common people's interests, it was a description of a functional system of social management that worked for several centuries. The Roman rules about citizenship are perhaps the most consequential and most sophisticated example of this pattern of strange rules with deep logic. Roman citizenship was not simply membership in a city-state, it was a legal status that came with specific rights, specific obligations, and specific protections that applied throughout the Roman world. A Roman citizen could not be tortured to extract testimony in most circumstances. A Roman citizen had the right of appeal to the emperor, which is why the Apostle Paul, according to the Acts of the Apostles, exercised his right as a citizen to be tried in Rome rather than in Judea. A Roman citizen could own property with full legal protections. A Roman citizen's word in a legal proceeding carried specific weight. What made Roman citizenship unusual in the ancient world was that it was not exclusively ethnic. It could be granted. Freed slaves born in Rome received citizenship. Communities that demonstrated loyalty to Rome and adopted Roman customs could be granted citizenship collectively. This happened to the Latins, to various Italian communities, and eventually under the Emperor Caracalla in 212 of our era to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. The logic behind this expansive citizenship policy was military and administrative. Rome needed soldiers. Rome needed loyal administrators for its provinces. Citizenship was the incentive that made military service and administrative cooperation attractive to people who were not ethnically Roman. A man from Spain or from North Africa or from Syria, who served in the Roman legions and received citizenship at the end of his service, was connected to Rome by a legal bond that gave him real, tangible benefits. He was not simply conquered, he was incorporated. That incorporation was one of the key mechanisms by which Rome managed to hold together an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia for several centuries. The rules about what Romans ate on a daily basis, separate from the luxury regulations, reveal another dimension of how thoroughly law and custom structured every aspect of Roman life. The Roman diet was structured around 3 meals: the ientaculum, a light breakfast eaten shortly after waking, typically consisting of bread, olives, cheese, and sometimes dried fruit or honey. The prandium, a light midday meal that was often eaten standing or walking, and consisted of similar simple foods. And the cena, the main meal of the day, eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, which was the only meal at which Romans typically sat down and took their time. The cena for ordinary Romans was nothing like the elaborate multi-course banquets that appear in descriptions of elite dining. It was typically a simple cooked meal of whatever vegetables, legumes and grain products were available and affordable, with meat appearing rarely for most people. Pork was the most common meat among those who could afford it. Fish, especially preserved fish like garum, was ubiquitous across all social classes. The diet was by modern nutritional standards reasonably balanced for the majority of the population, despite the complete absence of any understanding of nutrition as a science. The Roman approach to wine is worth a separate moment because it illustrates how Roman rules worked in practice. Wine was consumed at virtually every social level of Roman society, including by children, which strikes modern people as alarming, until you understand that the water quality in a city of 1 million people with imperfect sanitation was genuinely concerning, and that wine, especially wine mixed with water, in the traditional Roman ratio of roughly 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, was considerably safer to drink than untreated water from many Roman sources. The alcohol content of the diluted wine was low enough that the mixture would not cause intoxication, but high enough to inhibit the growth of the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous. The Romans did not know this was why wine drinking was safer than water drinking, but they had observed empirically that people who drank diluted wine consistently stayed healthier than people who drank water from suspect sources. The rule against drinking wine undiluted was partly about preventing drunkenness and its social consequences, but it was also, unconsciously, about maintaining the beneficial ratio between alcohol and water that made the beverage safe. Roman rules about slaves occupy one of the most uncomfortable and most complex spaces in the entire legal system. Roman slavery was brutal and dehumanizing in ways that require no qualification. Slaves were property. They could be bought, sold, beaten, worked to death, and sexually exploited with essentially no legal protection in the early Republic. But Roman law around slavery was not static, and the changes it underwent over several centuries reveal something about how legal systems respond to practical problems, even in the absence of moral pressure. The Lex Petronia of the 1st century of our era prohibited slave owners from throwing their slaves to wild beasts for entertainment without a magistrate's approval. This law was not passed because Romans suddenly developed moral qualms about the practice. It was passed because the practice was creating public disorder, because slaves who feared this fate were running away in numbers that created economic problems for their owners, and because the spectacle of random private citizens throwing their personal slaves to animals in public venues was creating crowd management challenges. The law solved a practical problem. The moral dimension was at best a secondary consideration. Similarly, the later imperial laws that gave slaves the right to seek refuge at the emperor's statue and complain about mistreatment so severe it threatened their lives were not primarily humanitarian measures. They were property protection measures. A slave worked to death or killed in a fit of rage was an economic loss to the owner, to the tax collector, and to the labor supply of the empire generally. Protecting slaves from the most extreme forms of mistreatment was protecting an economic asset. The practical logic and the humanitarian outcome overlapped. The motivation was the former, not the latter. The Roman legal system's approach to women is another area where the rules at first look straightforwardly oppressive, and on closer examination reveal something more complicated. Roman women of the citizen class could not vote, could not hold public office, and were legally under the authority of a male guardian, the paterfamilias, for most of Roman history. These are real limitations that require no minimizing. But within those limitations, Roman women of the propertied class had legal rights that women in many other ancient societies did not. They could own property in their own names. They could inherit, they could conduct business, they could divorce and remarry. They could appear in court as parties to legal proceedings even if they could not testify in most circumstances. The contradiction between the formal subordination of women and their actual practical power in Roman society is one of the most discussed topics in Roman social history. The answer, to the extent there is one, seems to be that the formal legal rules reflected ideological commitments to a particular social order, while the practical rules that governed daily life allowed considerably more flexibility. Roman women of the elite, particularly in the imperial period, exercised real influence on politics, economics, and culture through informal channels that the formal legal structure did not recognize but could not effectively prevent. The Emperor Augustus's moral legislation is the most ambitious attempt in Roman history to use law to change social behavior, and its failure is one of the most instructive examples of the limits of legal intervention in personal life. Augustus passed a series of laws in the late 1st century, before our era, designed to reverse what he saw as the moral decline of the Roman elite, specifically the declining birth rate among citizen families, the increasing frequency of divorce, and what he considered inappropriate sexual behavior among the upper classes. The laws penalized unmarried people and childless married people through inheritance restrictions. They rewarded families with 3 or more children through legal privileges. They criminalized adultery for the first time in Roman history, making it a public offense punishable by exile rather than a private matter to be handled within families. And they attempted to regulate the behavior of freed slaves who had become wealthy enough to threaten to displace old aristocratic families in the social hierarchy. The laws were deeply unpopular. They were widely evaded through technical workarounds that Roman lawyers enthusiastically developed for wealthy clients. They created genuine hardship for people in circumstances the legislation had not anticipated. Augustus's own daughter Julia was exiled under the adultery provisions, which created a political embarrassment that illustrated both the seriousness with which he intended the laws to be taken and the impossibility of applying them uniformly when powerful families were involved. The birth rate among the Roman elite did not recover. The divorce rate did not decrease. The social behavior the laws targeted continued largely unchanged among those wealthy enough to afford the workarounds. What the Augustan moral legislation illustrates is a principle that holds across all of Roman history, and indeed across most of human legal history. Laws can effectively regulate behavior that people engage in primarily for practical reasons, and that has clear economic or physical consequences for non-compliance. Laws cannot effectively regulate behavior that people engage in for deeply personal reasons and where the benefits of compliance are abstract, while the costs of compliance are immediate and personal. The Romans were remarkably sophisticated at the former. The Augustan legislation demonstrated their limits with the latter. Eleanor system in Roman courts is another area that reveals how deeply social reputation functioned as a regulatory mechanism in ways that formal law alone could not achieve. The concept of infamia, literally bad reputation, was a legal status that could be imposed on people who engaged in certain professions or behaviors considered incompatible with the dignity of a Roman citizen. Gladiators, actors, prostitutes, and certain categories of convicted criminals carried infamia as a legal designation that stripped them of specific citizen rights. They could not vote, could not hold public office, could not testify in court in most circumstances, and could not marry into respectable citizen families. The logic behind infamia was not simply moral condemnation. It was a recognition that certain activities, specifically those that involved putting your body on display for public entertainment or compensation, were considered incompatible with the independence of judgment that citizen participation in public life required. A man who performed for pay was, in Roman thinking, a man whose judgment and testimony could be bought. A man whose judgment could be bought was not a reliable participant in the collective decision-making processes that Roman civic life depended on. Therefore, he was excluded from those processes. The reasoning is circular in ways that are easy to identify from the outside, but the underlying concern about the reliability of testimony and the independence of civic participants was addressing a real problem in a legal system that depended heavily on witness testimony and character judgment. The Roman rules about names reveal another layer of social organization that operated through convention as much as law. A full Roman male citizen name had 3 parts. The pranomina, the personal name, of which there were only about 18 in common use for the entire Roman male citizen population. the nomen, the family name indicating which gens or clan you belonged to, and the cognomen, an additional name that originally indicated a specific branch of a family but over time became more varied and sometimes descriptively personal. The name Marcus Tullius Cicero tells you that this is a man named Marcus, from the Tullia gens, with the personal cognomen Cicero, which means chickpea, and which his family apparently acquired because an ancestor had a wart shaped like one. Women in the Roman system did not have pronomina in the later Republic and Imperial period. They were named after their father's gens in the feminine form. Julius Caesar's daughter was Julia. Marcus Tullius Cicero's daughter was Tullia. If a man had multiple daughters, they were distinguished as major and minor, elder and younger, or simply numbered. Julia Prima, Julia Secunda, Julia Tertia, First Julia, Second Julia, Third Julia, which from a modern perspective sounds impersonal to a remarkable degree, but which functioned efficiently in a system where family identity was primary and individual identity was secondary. Slaves had no legal names in the sense that Roman citizens had names because they had no legal identity. They were given names by their owners, often Greek names or names indicating their origin, which served as identifiers within a household but carried no legal weight. When a slave was freed and became a libitus, a freedman, he adopted his former owner's praenomen and nomen as his own, adding his slave name as a cognomen. This created the strange situation where a freed slave named Tiro, who had belonged to Marcus Tullius Cicero, became Marcus Tullius Tiro, sharing the first two elements of his name with the man who had owned him, which was simultaneously a marker of his dependent origin and a genuine incorporation into the family structure of his former master. The Roman rules about building heights in the city of Rome are another example of regulations that sound arbitrary and turn out to be responding to very specific practical problems. Augustus limited building heights in Rome to 70 Roman feet, approximately 21 meters, as part of his urban renewal program after several catastrophic building collapses in the late Republic. The insulae, the apartment buildings where most of Rome's population lived, had been built with minimal regulation in the explosive urban growth of the previous century. Some had reached heights that their construction methods and materials simply could not support safely. They collapsed. Sometimes they burned and the fire spread to neighboring buildings because the structures were too close together and too tall for fire control to be effective. The height limit was a direct response to those collapses and fires. It was subsequently raised and then lowered again by different emperors, as the tension between the need for housing density in a city of 1 million people and the safety concerns generated by that density played out across multiple administrations. Trajan eventually settled on a limit of 60 Roman feet that remained in effect through the high imperial period. The regulation was not perfect. Builders evaded it by various means, including simply bribing the inspector, but it established a principle of public regulation of private construction for safety reasons that was genuinely innovative in the ancient world and that influenced urban building codes in a direct line through Roman law to the building regulations of modern cities. The Roman calendar itself was a regulatory system with profound practical consequences that most people do not associate with law at all. The Roman calendar before Julius Caesar's reform was a political instrument managed by the pontifices, the priestly college responsible for religious matters including the calendar. The pontifices could add or remove days from the calendar as political circumstances required, extending the terms of favoured officials or shortening the terms of disfavoured ones. By the time Caesar became dictator, the calendar was approximately 3 months out of alignment with the solar year, meaning that January was occurring in what was astronomically October. Caesar's calendar reform of 46 before our era, implemented with the help of the Egyptian astronomer Socrates, established a 365-day year with a leap year every 4 years, and reset the calendar to alignment with the solar year. The reform required inserting approximately 90 extra days into the year 46 before our era to bring the calendar back into alignment, making that year 445 days long. Romans called it the year of confusion. Caesar called it necessary. The Julian calendar was not perfect. It slightly overestimated the length of the solar year by 11 minutes per year, which over 16 centuries accumulated into a 10-day discrepancy that eventually required the Gregorian reform of 1582. But it was a massive improvement over the politically manipulated chaos that preceded it, and established the basic structure of the calendar that most of the world still uses today. The months of our calendar, their lengths, the concept of the leap year, the names of the months themselves, all of these are Roman in origin. July is named for Julius Caesar. August is named for Augustus. The calendar is perhaps the most pervasive Roman rule that still governs daily life for billions of people who have no idea they are living under Roman legislation. The Roman rules about roads are the last element of this survey worth examining in detail because they illustrate the relationship between law, infrastructure, and imperial power more clearly than almost any other Roman institution. The Roman road system was not simply a network of paths made hard. It was a legally defined and legally maintained public infrastructure with specific rules about width, construction standards, right-of-way, maintenance responsibility, and permitted uses. Roman roads had legally defined widths for different categories of road. The via publica, the public road, had to be wide enough for two carts to pass each other, travelling in opposite directions. This was not simply a courtesy guideline. It was a legal specification that determined right-of-way in disputes and maintenance obligations for the communities through whose territory the road passed. The Via Militaris, the military road, had specifications that prioritized the movement of troops and supply wagons. The Via Privata, the private road, could be constructed to lower standards but came with restrictions on public use. The legal concept of right-of-way on Roman roads established principles that survive in modified form in traffic law today. A cart going downhill had right-of-way over a cart going uphill because stopping a loaded cart on a slope was dangerous and difficult. A funeral procession had right-of-way over ordinary traffic because impeding a funeral was a religious offence as well as a social one. The emperor's messengers, the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system had absolute right-of-way over all other traffic because the speed of imperial communication was a matter of state security. The cursus publicus itself was a legally mandated system that required communities along major roads to provide horses, vehicles, and accommodation for official imperial travellers. This was not a voluntary hospitality, it was a legal obligation backed by imperial authority. The system was efficient. It was also frequently abused by officials who travelled with larger retinues than their authorization permitted and demanded more horses and provisions than the law allowed. The gap between what the law specified and what actually happened on the ground in the Roman road system is a microcosm of the gap between Roman law as written and Roman law as practiced, which is one of the most consistent and most humanizing features of the entire Roman legal enterprise. The Romans wrote excellent laws, they enforced them imperfectly, selectively, and with considerable creative interpretation by all parties involved. Which is to say that Roman law worked approximately the way all law works in all times and places, which is to say imperfectly and humanly, and with results that were sometimes exactly what the lawmakers intended, and sometimes the precise opposite, and frequently something in between that nobody had anticipated at all. From the marble forums and regulated roads of Rome, we move now to a place that in some ways created the template that Rome spent centuries trying to copy, improve, and eventually absorb. We move to ancient Greece, and specifically to Athens in the 5th century before our era, which is simultaneously the birthplace of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, the birthplace of theatre, and one of the most rule-bound, regulation-heavy, obsessively structured societies that has ever existed, which is a combination that should surprise nobody who has spent any time thinking about how democracies actually function in practice. If you wake up as an Athenian citizen in the year 450 before our era, the the first thing you notice is that your day is going to be considerably more structured by collective obligation than you might prefer. Being a citizen of Athens was not simply a legal status that entitled you to rights. It was a role that came with specific enforceable duties that the city took very seriously, and that you were expected to take very seriously as well. The obligation to participate in the ecclesia, the citizen assembly, was not technically compulsory in the sense that you would be punished for not attending, but the Athenians developed a mechanism for encouraging attendance that was both ingenious and slightly humiliating. A rope dipped in red paint was dragged through the agora when the assembly was in session. Citizens found in the agora with red paint on their clothing were marked as people who had been present in the market when they should have been at the assembly. The red mark was a public indicator of civic irresponsibility that carried social consequences even without formal legal penalties. You could ignore your assembly duties, but you could not do so invisibly. This approach to civic obligation reveals something fundamental about how Athenian democracy understood the relationship between individual choice and collective responsibility. The assembly needed quorum to make legitimate decisions. If citizens could simply opt out of participation whenever it was inconvenient, the assembly would become a body representing only those with the time and inclination to attend, which would systematically favour the wealthy and the idle over the working citizen who had a farm to tend or a craft to practice. The red rope was an attempt to maintain the representative character of the assembly by making non-attendance visibly costly rather than comfortably invisible. The Athenian rules about the conduct of the assembly itself were remarkably sophisticated for a body of several thousand people making collective decisions. The agenda for each meeting was published in advance on wooden boards in the agora, giving citizens time to consider the issues before the meeting. Speakers addressed the assembly in sequence, not simultaneously. There were rules about interrupting speakers that could result in forcible removal from the speaking area. There were rules about the content of proposals, specifically that proposals had to be consistent with existing laws or include a provision to repeal the laws they conflicted with, which prevented the assembly from passing contradictory legislation in moments of enthusiasm that it would regret later. The graph paranomon, literally the indictment for illegal proposals, was a legal mechanism that allowed any citizen to prosecute another citizen for proposing a decree that violated existing Athenian law. If the prosecution succeeded, the original proposal was invalidated, and the person who had proposed it could face significant penalties. This meant that in Athens, proposing legislation was not a risk-free activity. You put your personal legal exposure on the line when you stood up in the assembly and argued for a change in the law. This created a powerful incentive for careful, considered proposals rather than impulsive or crowd-pleasing ones. It also created a powerful tool for political enemies to use against each other, which it was used for with considerable enthusiasm. The Athenian rules about who could speak in the assembly contained a provision that most people find surprising when they first encounter it. Anyone could speak. Any male citizen, regardless of wealth, family, or education, had the right to stand before the assembly and address thousands of his fellow citizens on any matter of public concern. This right was called isagoria, equality of speech, and it was considered one of the foundational principles of Athenian democracy. In practice, of course, not everyone exercised this right equally. Wealthy, educated, well-connected citizens had significant advantages in rhetorical training, in social networks that gave their words credibility, and in the time to prepare speeches. But the formal right was universal among citizens, and it was occasionally exercised by people of humble background, with results that the wealthy found deeply uncomfortable. The rules about Athenian jury courts reveal another dimension of how Athens managed the relationship between individual citizens and collective authority. Athenian juries were enormous by modern standards. A typical criminal trial might have 501 jurors, specifically an odd number to prevent tied decisions, Major cases could have 1,000 or more. These were not professional jurors selected for expertise. They were ordinary citizens selected by lot from a pool of volunteers who had registered for jury service for the year. The selection by lot was not accidental. Athens used sortition, selection by random lottery, for a wide range of positions and functions, precisely because it prevented wealthy and well-connected families from monopolizing those positions through elections that money and influence could affect. The lottery was the great equalizer. It gave every registered citizen an equal mathematical chance of serving regardless of their social position. In practice, poorer citizens who needed to work could not afford to volunteer for jury service unless the pay was sufficient, which it sometimes was and sometimes was not, which meant the jury pool skewed somewhat toward the wealthier and more leisured. But the principle of random selection rather than election or appointment was maintained consistently across a remarkable range of public functions. The pay for jury service, introduced by Pericles in the mid-5th century, is one of the most consequential and most debated innovations in Athenian democracy. Before pay was introduced, jury service was effectively limited to citizens who could afford to spend a day without income. After pay was introduced, poorer citizens could participate without financial sacrifice. The pay was not generous, approximately 2 obols per day in the mid-5th century, rising to 3 obols later, which was roughly what an unskilled labourer might earn in a day. But it was enough to make participation possible for people who would otherwise have been excluded by economic necessity. The political consequences of jury pay were significant. The citizen body that staffed Athenian juries after the introduction of pay was more economically diverse than before. It was also, critics argued, more susceptible to demagogic politicians who could win popular favour by prosecuting wealthy political enemies before juries of citizens who had economic grievances against the wealthy class generally. The Athenian comic playwright Aristophanes wrote an entire play, The Wasps, satirizing elderly Athenian citizens who had become addicted to jury service as a source of income and excitement in their retirement, delivering verdicts with more enthusiasm than discernment. The satire was pointed because it identified something real about how the institution worked in practice, as opposed to in theory. The Athenian rules about citizenship itself were among the most restrictive in the Greek world, which creates a striking contrast with the universalist rhetoric that Athenian democracy generated about itself. The citizenship law of Pericles, passed in 451 before our era, restricted Athenian citizenship to people who had 2 Athenian citizen parents, both mother and father. Before this law, citizenship had required only an Athenian citizen father, which had allowed the children of Athenian men who married foreign women to be citizens. The law eliminated that possibility. The stated justification was maintaining the purity of the citizen body and ensuring that citizenship reflected genuine connection to Athens. The practical effect was to exclude from citizenship the children of precisely the kind of intercommunity marriages that had been building economic and diplomatic connections between Athens and other Greek states. It also, not coincidentally, restricted the pool of potential citizens in a way that made each existing citizenship more valuable, which was an economic interest for current citizens even if they did not frame it in those terms. Pericles himself later had to request a special exemption from this law for his own son by the Milesian woman Aspasia, after his legitimate sons died in the plague of 430. The exemption was granted, which tells you something about how Athenian laws worked in practice when sufficiently powerful individuals needed them to work differently than they did in principle. The rules of Athenian symposia, the drinking parties that were the primary social institution of the Athenian elite, were as elaborately codified as anything in the political sphere, which tells you something about how seriously the Athenians took the regulation of social life generally. A symposium was not simply a party. It was a structured social event with specific rules about who could attend, how the space was arranged, how the wine was managed, what topics of conversation were appropriate, what forms of entertainment were permitted, and how the evening was expected to proceed. The symposium took place in the andron, the men's room of a private house, a space specifically designed for this purpose, with a raised border around the wall where the couches were arranged. Participants reclined on these couches, never sat, because reclining at meals was a marker of leisure and social status, distinguishing free Greek men from those who ate standing or sitting. Women, except for certain categories of entertainers and companions, were excluded. This was a male homosocial space where the bonds of friendship, political alliance, and intellectual exchange that structured Athenian elite life were formed and maintained. The wine at a symposium was managed by the symposiarch, a master of drinking elected at the beginning of the evening by the participants. The symposiarch determined the ratio of wine to water for the entire gathering, how many craters of mixed wine would be consumed, and the pace at which the drinking proceeded. This was not a trivial responsibility. Wine in the ancient world was typically stronger than modern wine because it was not produced with the precision fermentation control that modern winemaking allows. Consuming it undiluted was considered barbaric and could lead to the kind of behavior that ended friendships, created political enemies, and generated the sort of scenes that respectable Athenian men did not want associated with their households. The symposiarch's authority over the drinking was therefore a form of collective risk management. He was responsible for ensuring that the evening remained a civilized exchange of ideas, poetry, and political conversation, rather than descending into the kind of chaos that could embarrass everyone involved. A good symposiar calibrated the dilution and pace of drinking to keep participants relaxed and sociable without allowing anyone to become unmanageably intoxicated. This required judgment, social intelligence, and a clear understanding of the personal tolerances of the specific people in the room. It was considered a mark of social skill to be a good symposiar, and a mark of poor judgment to get that calibration wrong. The intellectual culture of the symposium produced some of the most important texts in the Western philosophical tradition. Plato's Symposium, which describes a drinking party at which Socrates and other prominent Athenians take turns giving speeches about the nature of love, is simultaneously a philosophical text and a realistic depiction of how Athenian intellectual life actually operated. The ideas that changed Western philosophy emerged not in formal academic settings, but in the context of carefully regulated social drinking, where the rules of the symposium created the conditions under which serious intellectual exchange could occur. The rules of Athenian religious life intersected with political life in ways that made them effectively inseparable. Athens had over 100 religious festivals per year, many of which required the participation of citizens in specific roles, the suspension of normal commercial and legal activity, and the expenditure of public funds on sacrifices, processions, and competitions. The religious calendar was simultaneously a civic calendar. Participating in the religious life of the city was participating in the civic life of the city, and refusing to participate in one was effectively refusing to participate in the other. The trial of Socrates in 399 before our era on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth illustrates how seriously Athens took the intersection of religious and civic obligation. Socrates was not prosecuted for his philosophical views in the abstract. He was prosecuted for a pattern of behavior that the prosecutors argued was systematically undermining the religious foundations of Athenian civic life by encouraging young men to question traditional beliefs, and by introducing what the prosecution characterized as new divine entities, specifically the daimonion, the inner voice that Socrates claimed guided his decisions. The charges were political as much as religious. Several of Socrates' prominent associates had been involved in the oligarchic governments that had briefly displaced Athenian democracy in the late 5th century. Prosecuting Socrates was in part a way of settling political scores, while using religious charges that were easier to bring and harder to defend against. But the charges worked, meaning they resonated with the jury of 501 citizens, because the underlying concern about the stability of Athenian religious and civic life was genuine. A society that relied on shared religious beliefs to maintain civic cohesion had a real interest in protecting those beliefs from systematic erosion. Whether Socrates was actually doing that, and whether executing him was an appropriate response if he was, are questions that philosophers have been debating for 24 centuries. The Athenians answered the first question yes, and the second question yes, with a jury vote of 280 to 221, which is a remarkably close vote for a decision that ended a man's life and that has haunted Western philosophy ever since. The Athenian rules about education reveal a society that took seriously the question of how citizens were formed without developing anything resembling a public school system in the modern sense. Athenian education was private, paid for by families, and therefore effectively limited to those who could afford it. There was no legal obligation to educate children, no state curriculum, no teacher certification system. And yet Athenian society produced a level of literary and philosophical culture in the 5th and 4th centuries that has never been matched in any comparable period and place in human history. The explanation lies partly in the culture of the symposium and the agora, the two great informal educational institutions of Athenian life, and partly in the specific pedagogical relationship of the Eristas and Eromenos, the older male mentor and the younger male student, which was the primary vehicle for the transmission of intellectual and civic values from one generation to the next. This relationship was simultaneously educational, social, and erotic, in a way that modern categories struggle to accommodate cleanly. The older man was expected to provide the younger with intellectual guidance, civic modeling, and social connections. The younger man was expected to provide the older with companionship and the social status that came from being seen as worthy of mentorship by a respected older citizen. The rules governing this relationship were elaborate and specific. The Orestes was expected to pursue the Eromenos through gifts, attention, and intellectual engagement rather than through direct sexual pressure. The Eromenos was expected to be receptive to the mentorship, but to exercise judgment about how far the physical dimension of the relationship extended. A boy who yielded too readily was considered to lack the self-control appropriate to a future citizen. A boy who refused all physical contact was considered cold and antisocial. The middle path, which involved some degree of physical intimacy while maintaining the boy's fundamental dignity and agency, was considered the appropriate navigation of a relationship that was understood to be temporary, educational, and ultimately oriented toward producing a better citizen. The rules about Athenian markets, the agora, reveal yet another dimension of how thoroughly Athens regulated economic life, while maintaining the appearance of a free market. The agora had market inspectors, the agora nomoi, who were responsible for ensuring that weights and measures were accurate, that goods were genuine rather than adulterated, and that prices were not manipulated in ways that harmed the broader public. There were separate inspectors for grain, the sitophilakes, because grain was the most politically sensitive commodity in Athens. A city that depended on imported grain for a significant portion of its food supply could not afford to have grain markets manipulated by speculators in ways that drove prices beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The rules about grain specifically were some of the most detailed and most seriously enforced of all Athenian commercial regulations. It was illegal to corner the grain market, to buy grain in bulk for resale at higher prices, or to ship Athenian grain to non-Athenian destinations. Violations were punishable by death, which is an indication of how seriously Athens regarded the stability of its grain supply. The grain regulations were not ideologically opposed to markets or profit. They were specifically targeting the behaviors that could turn an otherwise functional market into a vehicle for concentrated private gain at the expense of public catastrophe. The Athenian rules about slaves, like the Roman rules about slaves, occupy deeply uncomfortable territory that cannot be sanitized. Athens was a slave society in the most literal sense. The Athenian economy depended on slave labor to a degree that made the philosophical and political achievements of the free citizen class possible, in part because slaves were doing the physical work that would otherwise have consumed the time and energy of those citizens. The silver mines at Laurion, which funded much of Athenian prosperity and naval power, were worked by slaves in conditions that were lethal to a significant percentage of the workforce. The mortality rate in the mines was high enough that the slave population required constant replacement through purchase and capture. The Athenian approach to this contradiction between their democratic ideals and their dependence on slave labor was essentially to not acknowledge the contradiction as a contradiction. Slaves were defined as not fully human in the ways that mattered for political and moral purposes. This was not a position that all Athenians held unquestioningly. There are passages in Athenian literature that express discomfort with slavery and recognize something troubling about the institution. But those expressions of discomfort never translated into a serious political movement for abolition, in part because the economic interests invested in the continuation of slavery were too large and too widely distributed among the citizen class to be overcome by philosophical argument alone. The rules about metics, the foreign residents of Athens, reveal a society that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and exclusionary in ways that modern cities might recognize. Athens attracted immigrants from across the Greek world and beyond because it was the economic and cultural center of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 5th century. These immigrants, the metics, could live in Athens, conduct business in Athens, pay taxes in Athens, and serve in the Athenian military. What they could not do was own land in Attica, vote in the assembly, or become citizens regardless of how long they or their families had lived in Athens. The rules for metics were a careful calibration of inclusion and exclusion designed to capture the economic benefits of immigration, the skills, the trade connections, the capital that immigrants brought, while preserving the political privileges of citizenship for the existing citizen body. Many of the most prominent figures in Athenian intellectual and economic life were metics. Aristotle himself was a metic, born in Stagira in Macedonia, who lived and worked in Athens for decades without ever being eligible for citizenship. The philosopher who did more than almost anyone to define Western intellectual culture was a permanent resident alien in the city where he did his most important work. The Roman rules about gladiators contain details that most people who have seen every sword and sandal film ever made still do not know. The gladiatorial schools, the ludi, were not prisons. They were training facilities that operated more like professional sports organizations than detention centers, and the rules that governed them reflected that organizational logic with considerable sophistication. A gladiator entering a ludus signed or agreed to a contract, the auctoramentum, that specified the terms of his service. Free men who chose to become gladiators, and there were more of them than the popular image of the reluctant slave forced into the arena suggests, were giving up certain citizen rights in exchange for a salary, housing, food and medical care that was often superior to what they could obtain as free labourers. The lanista, the owner and manager of the gladiatorial school, had a financial interest in keeping his gladiators healthy and well trained, because they were his economic assets. A dead gladiator was a financial loss. A permanently injured gladiator was a financial loss. The medical care available to gladiators at major ludi was therefore better than what most free Romans could access, because the financial incentive to keep gladiators functional was direct and immediate. The diet of gladiators was specifically designed for their purpose, and was sufficiently distinctive that ancient sources comment on it. Gladiators were known as hordereae, barley men, because barley was the primary grain in their diet. This was not because barley was cheaper than wheat, though it was, but because barley produced a specific kind of body mass that the gladiatorial profession required. A layer of subcutaneous fat over well-developed muscle provided both the energy reserves for intense physical exertion and a degree of protection against surface wounds. A gladiator who was cut across the arm in a fight that was designed to display skill rather than produce death needed that cut to be spectacular without being disabling. The fat layer made surface wounds more dramatic and less dangerous simultaneously. The gladiatorial combat rules were as elaborate and specific as the rules of any modern professional sport, and for similar reasons, standardized rules allowed the crowd to understand and evaluate what they were seeing. Without standard rules, the combats would have been chaotic and incomprehensible to the audience. With standard rules, the crowd could appreciate skill, technique, and courage in ways that made the spectacle meaningful rather than simply brutal. Different categories of gladiator had specific weapons, specific armor, and specific fighting styles that were matched against each other according to traditional pairings. The retiarius fought with a net and trident and had minimal armor, relying on mobility and reach. He was traditionally paired against the secutor, who had heavy armor and a short sword but limited visibility through his almost enclosed helmet. The tactical challenge for each was built into the equipment asymmetry. The retiarius needed to keep distance and use the net to entangle the heavily armored secutor. The secutor needed to close distance and use superior armor to absorb the trident strikes while getting inside the reach advantage of the net. The crowd knew this dynamic and could evaluate how well each fighter was executing his tactical requirements. It was theatre and sport simultaneously, and the rules made it legible as both. The Roman rules about public speaking and rhetoric were as carefully developed as any other aspect of Roman civic life, and they produced in Cicero one of the greatest orators in the history of any language. Roman rhetorical education was systematic, progressive, and based on a theory of persuasion that distinguished carefully between different kinds of arguments and different kinds of audiences. The curriculum of Roman rhetorical education began with exercises called progymnasmata, preliminary exercises that trained students in the basic building blocks of argument. A student would be asked to narrate a fable, then to elaborate on it, then to refute it, then to argue for it, then to take a historical event and praise or blame the figure at its center, then to construct a comparison between two figures. Each exercise trained a specific skill, and the exercises built on each other in a sequence designed to develop the full range of capacities that a Roman advocate or politician would need. The most important Roman contribution to rhetorical theory was the concept of the 5 canons of rhetoric that Cicero articulated in his theoretical works: inventio, the finding of arguments; dispositio, the arrangement of those arguments; illocutio, the style in which they were expressed; memoria, the memorization of the speech; and pronuntiatio, the delivery including gesture, tone, and physical presence. A Roman advocate preparing a major court case was expected to work through all 5 of these stages systematically, and the quality of his work at each stage was evaluated both by his contemporaries and by his own professional standards. The rules about gesture in Roman oratory were codified with a precision that modern readers find remarkable. The actor and rhetorical theorist Quintilian devoted an entire book of his comprehensive treatise on rhetoric to the use of the hand in oratory. Different hand positions communicated different things to the audience. Different combinations of finger positions had specific conventional meanings. The movement of the hand from one position to another followed rules about what transitions were graceful and what transitions were awkward. A Roman advocate who violated these rules of gesture would be understood by his audience to be poorly trained, just as a modern athlete who violates the technical conventions of their sport is understood to be inadequately prepared. This codification of gesture seems obsessive until you realize that Roman oratory was conducted outdoors, in the forum before audiences of hundreds or thousands of people, without amplification, often in competition with ambient urban noise. In those conditions, physical presence and gesture were not decorative additions to the spoken argument. They were primary channels of communication that carried meaning across distances at which the words themselves might be difficult to hear clearly. The rules about gesture were rules about effective long-distance communication in conditions where modern technologies of sound amplification did not exist. The Greek rules about athletic competition at the Olympic Games reveal a society that was simultaneously deeply committed to physical excellence and deeply suspicious of the corruption that the pursuit of excellence could introduce. The Olympic Games were sacred to Zeus, and the rules governing them had religious as well as athletic dimensions. Competitors had to swear an oath before the statue of Zeus that they had trained for 10 months before the Games, and that they would not cheat. The oath was taken seriously because violating it was not simply a sporting infraction, it was a religious offense against Zeus himself. The penalties for cheating at the Olympics were designed to be maximally shaming rather than simply punitive. A competitor caught cheating was fined, and the fine was used to erect a bronze statue of Zeus in the sacred precinct at Olympia. The statue bore an inscription identifying the cheater by name and city and describing the offense. These statues, called zanes, lined the path to the stadium so that every competitor in every subsequent Olympics had to walk past the publicly displayed record of previous cheating as they entered the competition. The shame was permanent, public, and geographical. You could not attend the Olympics without confronting the evidence of what cheating at the Olympics meant. The Greek rules about hospitality, xenia, were among the most important social rules in the entire ancient Greek world, and their violation was considered one of the most serious offences a person could commit. Xenia was not simply politeness to strangers. It was a sacred obligation backed by divine sanction. Zeus Xenius, Zeus in his aspect as protector of guests and strangers, was believed to observe the treatment of travellers and to punish violations of hospitality with divine wrath. The rules of Xenia were specific. A host was obligated to offer an arriving stranger food, drink, and a bath before asking who they were or where they came from. The questions came after the needs were met, not before. A guest was obligated to behave with appropriate restraint, to not overstay their welcome, and to reciprocate the hospitality if the host ever arrived at their door. The exchange created a bond between host and guest that could extend across generations. The children of a host and guest inherited the obligation to treat each other with the same hospitality their parents had extended. The Trojan War in Greek mythology was in part a story about the catastrophic consequences of violating xenia. Paris, the Trojan prince, came to the house of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, as a guest, was treated with hospitality, and then departed with Menelaus's wife Helen. This was not simply adultery or theft. It was a violation of the sacred guest-host relationship that brought down divine wrath and 10 years of catastrophic war on both sides. The myth was doing the work of illustrating why xenia mattered. A world in which travellers could not trust that they would be treated safely by strangers was a world in which trade, diplomacy, and the movement of ideas could not function. Xenia was the infrastructure of ancient Greek international relations, and the gods were its enforcement mechanism. The Persian rules about the treatment of water are another example of a regulation that looks purely religious and turns out to have deeply practical dimensions. Zoroastrian religious law prohibited the pollution of water, fire, earth, and air as sacred elements. Defiling a river or a water source with waste or corpses was a serious religious offense that required elaborate ritual purification. This prohibition had the practical effect of protecting the water sources that communities depended on from the kind of contamination that in the ancient world routinely caused the waterborne diseases that killed large numbers of people. The Persians did not understand germ theory.
El sol se está
They did
poniendo.
not know
Debemos
that
irnos.
fecal
Espera,
contamination of
quiero
water
ver el
sources
Coliseo una vez
caused
más.
cholera and typhoid and dysentery. But they had observed over generations that communities that maintained strict rules about what could be disposed of in water sources were healthier than communities that did not. The religious prohibition codified that empirical observation in a form that was enforced by divine sanction rather than by public health inspection. The mechanism was theological. The outcome was epidemiological. And the protection it provided was real regardless of whether the people following the rule understood why it worked. The Persian rules about the royal gardens, the paradisus from which we get the word paradise, reveal an aspect of Achaemenid culture that the military-focused Greek sources largely ignore. The Persian kings maintained elaborate enclosed gardens at each of their palace complexes. These gardens contained trees, plants, and animals from across the empire, assembled as a kind of living demonstration of the reach of Persian imperial power. A garden that contained plants from Egypt and animals from India, and trees from the forests of Anatolia, was a physical map of the empire's extent, a claim made in living material rather than in text or stone. But the gardens were also functional spaces with rules about their maintenance and use that reveal sophisticated horticultural knowledge. Persian gardeners understood irrigation, soil preparation, and the management of microclimates within enclosed spaces in ways that allowed them to grow plants from very different regions in a single location. The garden layouts that archaeologists have uncovered at Persian palace sites show sophisticated water management systems, symmetrical planting schemes, and evidence of careful attention to the relationship between different plant species. The word paradisos itself, which the Greeks borrowed from the old Iranian paradisa, meaning walled enclosure, passed through Greek into Latin as paradisus, and from Latin into every major European language as paradise. The concept of paradise, the ideal garden, the perfect enclosed space of natural beauty and abundance, is a Persian imperial concept that became one of the foundational images of three of the world's major religions. The Garden of Eden in Genesis, the Gardens of Paradise in Islamic theology, the Paradise of Christian afterlife imagery, all draw on an image whose specific cultural origin was the enclosed royal gardens of the Achaemenid Persian kings. That is perhaps the most surprising thing about the weird rules of the ancient world. They do not stay in the ancient world. They travel. They transform. They arrive in unexpected places wearing completely different clothing. The Persian garden becomes paradise. The Roman calendar becomes our calendar. The Athenian jury becomes the trial by jury of the Anglo-American legal tradition. The gladiatorial games become professional sports with salary caps and medical staff, and the crowd deciding whether a competitor gets to continue. The rules change. The problems they are solving remain remarkably consistent. How do you organize large groups of people with competing interests? How do you create systems that are robust enough to survive the incompetence and corruption of the people running them? How do you balance individual freedom against collective necessity? How do you manage scarce resources without destroying the productive capacity that generates those resources? How do you maintain legitimacy when the people you are governing have enough power to make governing them very difficult if they decide to stop cooperating? Every weird rule we have looked at tonight was an attempt to answer one or more of those questions. Some answers were better than others. Some were remarkably good for their time and became the foundations of institutions we still use. Some were deeply unjust in ways that the people living under them often recognized, even if they could not change them. And some were simply mistakes that looked reasonable at the time and turned out to be wrong in ways that became clear only later. Which is exactly how our rules will look to people 2,000 years from now. Partly brilliant, partly inexplicable, partly deeply unjust in ways that will seem obvious in retrospect, and entirely human in their combination of genuine problem-solving intelligence and spectacular creative, often self-serving failure to see what should have been obvious. The ancient world was not a simpler time. It was a different time, The people were not simpler. They were different in their knowledge and their context, but not in their fundamental humanity. They were trying to solve hard problems with incomplete information under conditions of genuine uncertainty. Exactly like us, exactly always. Sleep well. From the marble columns of Athens we travel now, to a civilization that most people in the Western tradition know primarily as the villain in someone else's story. The Persians appear in Greek history as the invaders, the threat, the foreign empire that Athens and Sparta united to repel at Marathon and Thermopylae and Salamis. What that framing systematically obscures is that the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before our era, was by almost any measure the most sophisticated, most tolerant, and most administratively innovative empire the ancient world had produced up to that point. And it had rules, extraordinary rules. Rules that the Greeks who fought against it borrowed extensively once they realized how well those rules worked. If you wake up as a subject of Darius the Great in the year 500 before our era, the first thing you notice is that nobody is asking you to change your religion. This is not what you would expect from an empire that controls territory from the Indus River in the east to Egypt in the west, from the Black Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south, an empire containing dozens of distinct peoples, speaking dozens of distinct languages, and practicing dozens of distinct religions. The standard ancient imperial approach to this kind of diversity was assimilation by force. You adopt our gods, our language, our customs, or you face consequences. The Achaemenid approach was almost precisely the opposite. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with cuneiform text, discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now housed in the British Museum, records the decree of Cyrus the Great following his conquest of Babylon in 539 before our era. The text describes Cyrus allowing the peoples he had conquered to return to their homelands, rebuild their temples, and worship their own gods under Persian protection. The Jews who had been exiled to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar were among those who returned to Judea under this policy. The Hebrew Bible records Cyrus as an instrument of divine will for this reason. The man who made this possible was not Jewish. He was a Zoroastrian Persian king who had decided that allowing conquered peoples to maintain their religious and cultural identities was better policy than forcing them to abandon those identities. The practical logic behind this policy was administrative efficiency. An empire of 23 satrapies, the administrative provinces into which the Achaemenid Empire was divided, could not be governed by direct Persian administration of every local matter. The satraps, the provincial governors, were typically Persian aristocrats who oversaw the broad outlines of imperial policy, specifically tax collection, military recruitment and maintenance of order, while leaving local governance, local law, local religious practice, and local cultural life largely to the existing local institutions. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt with Persian imperial support, not because the Persian kings were secretly Jewish, but because a functioning local religious institution was a more efficient mechanism of social order than a direct Persian military presence in every Jewish community. The Achaemenid tax system was another area where Persian administrative sophistication produced rules that look remarkably modern in their structure. Each satrapy paid tribute to the imperial center, but the tribute was assessed based on the productive capacity of the province, rather than a flat rate applied uniformly across the empire. Egypt paid in grain because Egypt produced grain in extraordinary quantities. Babylon paid in silver because Babylon was a commercial and banking center. The Indian provinces paid in gold dust. Media paid in horses.
El sol se está poniendo.
The tribute
Debemos
was
irnos.
calibrated
Espera,
to what
quiero
each
ver el
region could
Coliseo una
actually
vez más.
produce and deliver, without destroying the economic base that made the tribute possible in the first place. This sounds obvious in retrospect, but it was not the standard ancient imperial practice. Most ancient empires extracted tribute in a form convenient to the imperial center, without particular concern for whether the extraction was sustainable or calibrated to regional productive capacity. The Achaemenid approach of matching tribute type to regional production created a self-sustaining system that could be maintained over generations without exhausting the provinces. It also required a level of administrative knowledge about the productive capacity of each region that was itself a remarkable achievement of imperial information management. The Persian royal road system was the infrastructure that made this administrative sophistication possible. The royal road ran from Susa, the administrative capital of the empire, to Sardis in western Anatolia, a distance of approximately 2,700 kilometers. Herodotus records that a normal traveller took 90 days to cover this distance. The royal couriers of the Persian imperial postal system, the Angarium, covered it in 7 days. 7 days for 2,700 kilometers, using relays of fresh horses stationed at intervals along the road. That is a speed of communication that was not exceeded in the region for more than 2,000 years, until the telegraph arrived in the 19th century of our era. The rules governing the Angarium were strict and specific. Courier stations were positioned at intervals of approximately 25 kilometers, roughly the distance a horse could cover at speed before needing rest. Each station maintained a supply of fresh horses and riders who were ready to take the message pouch and continue the relay without pause. The courier who arrived at a station handed off the message, and that was the end of his leg of the journey. The message continued with a fresh horse and a fresh rider. Herodotus described the system with a phrase that was later adopted as the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. He wrote it about the Persian imperial postal system, not the American one. The rules about access to the Persian king, the protocols of the royal court, were among the most elaborate and most rigidly enforced anywhere in the ancient world, and they reveal something important about how the Achaemenid kings understood the relationship between royal authority and royal accessibility. The king was not simply a powerful ruler. He was a semi-divine figure whose physical person was surrounded by layers of ritual protection that served both practical and symbolic functions. Approaching the king required passing through multiple layers of chamberlains, guards, and officials. You could not simply walk into the royal presence. You had to be announced, vetted, approved, and escorted. When you finally entered the presence of the king, the protocol required that you prostrate yourself completely, face down on the floor, in the gesture called proskynesis. This was not simply a bow. It was a full prostration that placed you physically lower than the king in the most literal possible sense. The Greeks who encountered this practice were scandalized by it, because in Greek culture proskynesis was a gesture reserved for the gods. Performing it before a human being seemed to them to be treating a man as if he were divine, which violated the Greek understanding of the proper relationship between humans and the divine. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and attempted to introduce proskynesis at his own court, his Macedonian companions refused, and the resulting conflict was one of the most serious crises of his reign. The Macedonians were willing to follow Alexander to the ends of the earth, but they were not willing to bow to him like Persians. What the Greeks missed in their reaction to proskynesis was that for the Persians the gesture did not necessarily imply that the king was literally divine. It implied that the king occupied a position of such supreme authority and such comprehensive power that the appropriate physical expression of that relationship was total submission. The king was not a god, but he was the mediator between the divine order and the human world, the representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme Zoroastrian deity, in the mortal realm. The prostration acknowledged that relationship. It was a theological statement about the structure of the cosmos as the Persians understood it, not simply a political statement about power. The practical function of the elaborate court protocol was access control and information management. A king who could be approached directly by anyone who could fight their way through to him was a king who would spend most of his time managing the chaos of unfiltered petitions, complaints, and demands. The layers of protocol filtered that chaos and ensured that what reached the king's attention had been pre-screened, organized, and presented in a form that allowed efficient decision-making. The semi-divine isolation of the king was simultaneously a theological statement and an administrative efficiency measure. The Achaemenid approach to conquered peoples extended into law in ways that were unusually sophisticated for the ancient world. When Darius the Great organized the administration of Egypt after its conquest, he instructed his officials to compile a record of Egyptian law as it had existed under the last native pharaoh. That compilation was to serve as the basis for legal administration in Egypt under Persian rule. The Persians were not imposing Persian law on Egypt. They were asking Egyptians to codify their own law so that the Persians could administer it properly. This legal pluralism was consistent across the empire. The Babylonians continued to be governed by Babylonian law. The Jews in Judea were governed by Jewish law in most matters that did not involve imperial interests. The various Greek cities of Ionia that came under Persian control were governed to a significant degree by their own civic laws. The Persians reserved imperial law for matters of imperial concern, primarily taxation, military service, and maintenance of order, and left the vast domain of ordinary civil and criminal matters to local legal traditions. The contrast with Roman imperial law, which gradually extended Roman legal categories across the entire empire, is instructive. Both approaches had advantages and disadvantages. Roman legal universalism created a common legal language across the empire that facilitated trade, administration, and the integration of diverse peoples into a common framework. Persian legal pluralism reduced administrative costs and resistance to imperial rule by allowing subject peoples to live under familiar legal systems. Neither was obviously superior in all respects. They were different solutions to the same fundamental problem of governing diverse peoples across vast territories. The Persian rules about food and feasting reveal a court culture that was simultaneously austere by Greek and Roman elite standards, and overwhelming in its scale by the standards of what most people in the ancient world experienced. The Greek sources that describe the Persian royal table tend to emphasize the quantities of food prepared and the elaborate organization required to provision the king's table as the court moved between the imperial capitals of Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana. Thousands of people travelled with the Persian court, and all of them had to be fed according to their rank and their relationship to the king. The provisioning records that survive from Persepolis, the administrative tablets known as the fortification texts, give us an extraordinary level of detail about how the Persian imperial food supply actually worked. Rations of grain, beer, wine, and other foodstuffs were distributed through a bureaucratic system that tracked every recipient, every quantity, and every distribution point. Workers at Persepolis who were building the Great Palace complex received food rations calculated according to their skill level, their sex, and their nationality. Skilled workers received more than unskilled ones. Adults received more than children. The records are detailed enough that modern historians can calculate the daily caloric intake of Persian imperial construction workers and compare it to modern nutritional standards. What the fortification texts reveal is an imperial economy that was managed with a level of administrative precision that should surprise anyone who thinks of ancient empires as operating primarily through force and fear. The Persian imperial bureaucracy tracked the movement of goods and the entitlements of workers across an empire of millions of people, It did so using clay tablets and human messengers rather than computers and telecommunications. The organizational achievement this represents is genuinely remarkable. The rules about Zoroastrian religious practice, the official religion of the Achaemenid court, even while other religions were tolerated throughout the empire, reveal a theological system with unusual practical dimensions. Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion that posits a cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the principle of truth, light, and good, and Angra Mainyu, the principle of falsehood, darkness, and evil. Human beings participate in this cosmic struggle through their choices and their actions. Truth-telling is not simply a moral virtue in Zoroastrianism. It is a participation in the divine struggle against the principle of evil. Lying is not simply a social failing, it is a participation in the forces of cosmic darkness. This theological framework gave Persian royal ideology a distinctive character. The royal inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes repeatedly emphasized truth-telling and the king's commitment to truth as central to his royal legitimacy. Darius, in his great inscription at Behistun, describes his conquest of rebellions against Persian authority in terms of the struggle between truth and the lie. The rebels are not simply political enemies. They are agents of falsehood, who threaten the cosmic order that the king is obligated to maintain. This is not simply propaganda in the modern sense. It reflects a genuine Zoroastrian theological understanding of political authority as a dimension of the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. The practical consequence of this theology for Persian administrative culture was a strong emphasis on accurate record-keeping, honest reporting, and reliable communication. A courier who falsified a message was not merely betraying his administrative function, he was participating in the principle of the lie that threatened the cosmic order. The same logic applied to officials who falsified tribute records or merchants who used inaccurate weights. The religious sanction for accuracy in reporting and honesty in dealing reinforced the administrative interest in reliable information and honest accounting in ways that created a mutually reinforcing culture of bureaucratic precision. The Persian rules about warfare, specifically about the treatment of conquered peoples and defeated enemies, were generally more restrained than the practices of most ancient Near Eastern empires, though the Greek sources who describe Persian military conduct are not always reliable narrators, given that they were typically writing about an enemy. The Assyrian practice of wholesale deportation of conquered populations, the Neo-Babylonian practice of destroying the temples of conquered gods, and the various ancient Near Eastern traditions of extreme cruelty toward defeated enemies as a form of deterrence were not characteristic of Achaemenid practice, as the archaeological and documentary record reveals it. This relative restraint was not humanitarian sentiment in the modern sense. It was policy calculation. An empire that routinely massacred or enslaved conquered populations created exactly the kind of desperate resistance that made future conquests more costly and future administration more difficult. An empire that conquered populations, installed Persian administrators over their existing social structures, demanded tribute, and largely left people to live their lives as before, faced less resistance and required less ongoing military investment to maintain control. The Achaemenid restraint in conquest was a strategic choice that paid administrative dividends over the 2 centuries of the empire's existence. The fall of the Achaemenid Empire to Alexander the Great, between 334 and 323, before our era, is one of the most dramatic events in ancient history. What is less often noted is how much of the Persian administrative system Alexander preserved and adopted after his conquest. He kept Persian satraps in many provinces. He adopted Persian court ceremonial, including the proskynesis that his Macedonian companions found so offensive. He married Persian aristocratic women and encouraged his officers to do the same. He wore Persian royal dress alongside his Macedonian armor. He was not simply destroying Persia. He was attempting to inherit it and transform himself into a legitimate Persian king as well as a Macedonian one. The synthesis he was attempting to create, a fusion of Greek and Persian administrative traditions under his personal authority, was never completed because he died at 32 in Babylon in 323 before our era. But the impulse behind it was strategically sound. The Persian administrative system was sophisticated enough that anyone who wanted to govern the territories it had governed needed to either adopt it or develop something equivalent. Alexander understood this. His successors, the Diadochi who divided his empire after his death, understood it too. The Seleucid Empire that governed much of the former Persian territory continued many Achaemenid administrative practices. The Parthian and Sasanian Persian empires that eventually reclaimed the Iranian heartland drew heavily on Achaemenid tradition in their administrative organization. The legacy of the Achaemenid Empire is therefore not simply the legacy of a civilization that was conquered and disappeared. It is the legacy of administrative innovations that were too effective to be discarded by the people who conquered it. The postal relay system, the satrapal system of provincial administration, the practice of leaving local laws and religious practices in place, while imposing imperial requirements at the level of taxation and military service, the detailed bureaucratic record-keeping that tracked the movements of goods and people across vast territories. All of these were Persian innovations that outlasted the Persian Empire in the administrative practices of every state that succeeded it in the region. And that perhaps is the most important thing to understand about the weird rules of the ancient world generally. They were not arbitrary. They were not the product of ignorance or irrationality or simple tradition following. They were solutions to real problems, developed by people who were trying to govern complex societies with the tools and knowledge available to them. Some of those solutions were brutal, some were ingenious, some were both simultaneously, but they were all attempts to manage the fundamental challenge of human social organization, which is how you get large numbers of people with different interests, different backgrounds, and different beliefs to cooperate sufficiently to produce civilization. The Romans did it with law and infrastructure and a citizenship that could be extended to incorporate outsiders. The Athenians did it with direct democracy and the social pressure of a small city where everyone knew everyone else and your reputation was your most valuable possession. The Persians did it with administrative sophistication and a policy of tolerance that allowed diverse peoples to maintain their identities within an imperial framework. None of them got it entirely right. All of them got something right that the others missed. And the civilization we live in today is in some measure the product of all three, filtered through centuries of subsequent history, still arguing about the same fundamental questions they were arguing about, still making the same kinds of mistakes they made, still occasionally producing the same kinds of breakthroughs that they produced when the circumstances aligned, and the right people were in the right place at the right time, with enough of a good enough idea to change something permanently. The weird rules were not a sign of how different those people were from us. They were a sign of how similar. They were trying to solve the same problems we are still trying to solve. They just had different tools, different knowledge, and 2,000 years less accumulated experience to draw on, which is not nothing. But it is also not everything, because the problems have not changed nearly as much as we would like to think. Sleep well.